Doris, the first time we met was 2010, and I visited you in your studio in Bogota. Would you like to share for 1 minute? Because I felt I was so impressed. We just talked about it in a different way. I think an artist like you are, you say, for every new piece, I'm a new person. You start researching, you start anew, you start with a clear mind. It's a new compassion, but you have a team that's so important. Would you like to describe that a little bit, how your studio, how your practice functions?
Yes. When we met in Bogota, it was a beautiful moment because your response to my work was very emotional and sincere, and I will never forget that moment. It was really extraordinary response to a piece that was about mourning. So all of my work is about mourning. I've been immersed in mourning for the past 40 years. But in order to do that work, I need a team. And that's why I always speak of my work as I always say that my solitary practice as an artist is a collective endeavor. First of all, because I need the testimony of a victim of political violence to share their experience that I have not had. And when they share their experience, then I get a glimpse into that world, into what it means to be thrown out, kicked out of humankind. So how does it feel to be in the periphery of humankind? What do they do? What do they feel? What do they think? So in order to know that, as you were saying before, I try to erase everything I know every time I start a piece, in order to have a little bit more knowledge. I have to know something new when I make the piece. I wish I could be a different person. I know that's not possible, but that's my attempt. I always attempt to be a different person every time I make a piece. It is like the idea, the understanding I have of the present has to be augmented, has to grow, has to be more intense or wider. And hopefully the work will do the same to the public.
The new persona, the new person that's starting, you do a lot of research, you read a lot, you conduct interviews, you conduct conversations, you visit, you travel with some of the victims. My introduction to Colombia was 10 years before I met you through Susan Sontag. Susan Sontag hosted a lot of movie festivals and film festivals, and we went to a movie, The Lady of the Assassins. And in one of the scenes in that movie, you actually see two people talking, and behind there is a fridge, an old fridge like garbage, and next to the old fridge are two dead bodies. And we talked a lot about that scene, that Colombia, and we talked a lot about it, for a long time was a very extreme country, and now that extreme of Colombia is basically taking over the whole world. Colombia has around 50 million inhabitants. Colombia has about internally displaced 9 million, so every fifth person is displaced in Colombia. Colombia has 4 million migrants, refugees from Venezuela. So think about a country of 50 million with 9 million displaced and 4 million. Talk a little bit about how secure or insecure that makes a person feel living in such a country.
Well, living in Colombia means living in the midst of in the center and the epicenter of catastrophe. So catastrophe is endless, because in other parts of the world, catastrophe stops or begins. But for us, it's continuous, a continuous catastrophe. That has several implications for an artist. It's like I cannot choose the subject. The topics I deal with are embedded in my reality, are in front of my eyes. There's no escape. I cannot play the game that other people can play, let's say in the global north, that we don't know. We don't know the suffering of migrants, we don't know the suffering of war, we don't know. That game I cannot play. So it is, but at the same time, as hard as it is to be in this permanent, working from this permanently negative perspective, it is important because you are embedded in the world. You're right there. It's not that you're observing, having a cold distance, having a perspective. No, you're right there. You're in the center. And I always like to quote a sentence by Flaubert that is quite beautiful. He said, "With my burned hand, I write about fire." So that's how an artist has to work, or at least that's how I see it. So that's what it means to be working from Colombia.
You're not an artist sitting in Paris or London thinking about political pieces and crime and victims and migrants. You're in Colombia. I remember you told me you were friends with I think it was a bishop, he was a clerical person. And I said, what's he doing now? And you said, oh, he's being murdered. And then Jaime Garcia, the cartoonist, he got murdered, and there was 2 kilometers of roses that you conducted through the city of Bogota. So a person you know is being murdered, and you are conducting a memorial. Are you actually afraid? Because it's one thing to be a political artist and sit far away, but you're in midst of your friends. Are you?
No, I'm not afraid, and I don't think I'm in danger. I'm careful. I do go to difficult war zones, or I deal with difficult people, but I'm very careful. I'm always well accompanied. I always, I know what I'm doing. I don't go by myself to do crazy things. I know exactly where I'm going, and I have a purpose. And no, I'm not afraid, but one thing that is important to note is that pain hurts. So when you are facing pain, there's no way it's gonna hurt. But when you are exposed to traumatic events, to horrible events, those terrible events happened to people who have beautiful lives, or at least aspired to have a beautiful life, people who desire to have a beautiful life. So as an artist, I have to take that human misery, that terrible thing that happened, and then bring it up. My work starts from misery, but then I have to create a different horizon, and I wish my work would be like a bridge that can connect the horror, the misery of human condition to a level where desires and hopes can be visible, can be inscribed to that lost life. So yeah, it comes from something that is difficult, but then I have to elevate that experience in order to re-enter into the sphere of humanity those people who had been so brutally expelled from it. And I have to do so in a delicate manner, in such a way that I don't know how to say, I don't touch that victim. That person and that on those events remained at a certain distance and are kind of suspended in like the work here. You see this brutal reality suspended in an enclosed space that allows you the time and hopefully bring memories that can connect to that lost life.
When Pussy Riot, they were incarcerated, they were imprisoned in Moscow, and then they were released. And when they first were released, they visited New York. And I had just installed an exhibition where we had Joseph Beuys once, the artist Joseph Beuys. He allowed so many masterclass students, and he said civil disobedience, civil courage. And he allowed so many students that the police escorted him out of the academy. It's a very famous picture. Police person left, police person right, Joseph Beuys in the middle. And there is a famous work he made, a postcard he made out of it. In German it says, Demokratie ist lustig, democracy is fun. It doesn't sound lustig at the moment, doesn't sound fun now. And I was out of my mind. I basically said to Pussy Riot, I would have been so afraid with a police person left and right and in my own art school being escorted out. And they laughed at me because they had just come out of prison in Moscow, out of a cage. But they said something really interesting. They said, no, he is not courageous. He wasn't afraid. He couldn't do but do that.
Yeah.
And that is an explanation why, that's the only explanation how I can explain your courage. Because, for example, in 1985, the whole world knew about it, saw it on TV. Palace of Justice in Bogota, total takeover, everybody killed, completely destroyed. 17 years later, country is not really a better country, you started secretly sneaking up onto the roof of the Palace of the Republic, of the Justice, and preparing a monumental piece we're going to see later. So what is it that drives you into that fearlessness? Is it just there's nothing else you can do to make it better?
Yes, it's impossible. Because once you know the experience of pain that people have endured, there's no way you can forget about that. You are connected to that, and it is, I don't know, it is a matter of I feel like I'm a gambler, and I'm gambling my life, which is peace. And I have to do it. I don't doubt. I don't even have that option. It is what I have to do, and I work until it is done, no matter what it takes. And that's what I think gives the piece the power. The philosopher Paul Ricoeur, he said that humankind is not a species, a biological species, that humankind is defined by its acts. And I love that idea. So I see each one of my works as an act of mourning that give us back the humanity we lose every time a violent act takes place. So that's an absolutely essential element. I cannot not do it.
Our last long conversation was digital during COVID. I was in Los Angeles and you were in Colombia, and you said something very important that I keep on thinking about. And you basically said, I grew up in a country that is endless catastrophe. All of a sudden, the whole world has a catastrophe. Democracy is on the decline. And you feel like the global north is finally adopting the rules of the global south. Can you share this with everybody? Because I think it's a fascinating observation from your perspective, looking at what's happening at the moment in these tectonic shifts about where democracy is going, where the economy is going, where safety is going, where political freedom or freedom of speech is going.
Yeah, when I was young, we were told that we live in an underdeveloped country that at some point will develop. If we behave properly, if we pay the external debt, if we, I don't know, whatever, if we adhere completely to Western culture, we will develop, and then everybody will be happy. And unfortunately, the very opposite had happened. Unfortunately, the first world is underdeveloped. Developing. I think advanced capitalism has brought us all into a level of brutality that only the global south knew. So we, the people who have been colonized, who have been invaded, we have a perfect idea of what it is to lose your culture, what it is to lose your world, and having another world imposed on us. But unfortunately now, with the climate crisis, we are all losing the world. It's not just us, it's everybody. So that's the experience I had from my perspective. Unfortunately, I wish it were the opposite.
It was very humbling to have a talk during COVID where COVID was the least of our problems. So yes. I think for me, art is also a form of hope. And you said art is what describes humanity. What I would propose now is we go through, we prepared 150 slides, so the talk will approximately last for 3.5 hours. So I hope you all are well nourished and have good stamina. I think we should start with the first of our 150 slides. Can we switch them on? Doris, I was fortunate enough to install this piece, one of these pieces, in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art, and I only knew it and I wanted to install it, but I had no idea. Then you learn that you have to build another wall because that's actually in the wall. You have to come from the behind to put it in, and then you read the label, because of course, how do you even? And then I read the label, and I can't remember which animal, but it's either pig or cow's bladder. Cow bladder. So you read the materials, so it's cow bladder, shoe, stitches.
Surgical thread.
Surgical thread. So what we look at is actually a little negative space in the wall, like a shoebox. And the shoebox contains shoes. And the box, the negative space in the wall, is closed, stitched, closed, with cow bladder. When you touch it, install it, then of course you have this incredible fragility. But looking at it as a viewer, do you want to give us a little bit of a introduction into this work that we picked as the first work to introduce?
This is an early work that I made in 1992, I believe. And it was referring to something that at that time was mostly happening in Latin America, which is the missing people for political reasons. So I was doing a research on missing people. I was guided through that research by a wonderful lawyer that unfortunately was also killed. And at the time, DNA tests were not so common, so people were mostly identified by their shoes. And so that's how I started doing this. That's why I started focusing on the shoes and focusing on the missing people, people that occupy this terrible, this liminal space there. If the body is not found, the family cannot really grieve properly and work mourning as it should be. So there is no healing for these families. At that time, it was I was thinking mostly in Latin America, but now that so many migrants are getting missed, disappearing in the sea, in the desert, it becomes unfortunately actualized.
You told me at the time, and that I said, what are we talking about, kind of, and you said it's north of 100,000 people. It's not like missing people, like we're missing 100, 200. This is like...
There is 100,000 people missing in Colombia. So I wanted to take the pain of each individual family and create a public space in which an attempt to close this social wound will be made. So that's why there are surgical stitches through the wall, which is an absurd act and extremely difficult. Of course, never nearly as difficult as finding a missing person.
100,000 people missing is 100,000 families mourning. you explained to me the statistics. It's kind of strange to talk about statistics because every person is their own life. But you said that amongst those that are missing, there's a certain statistical logic. So men are normally killed relatively soon after they disappear. Women often are kept for months or being used, being abused, being raped.
Yeah, that's why like 90%, 95% of the shoes are female shoes, and only a couple of male shoes. I think that they had men were killed quickly, and women were raped. And I think, well, of course, rape is a political crime, even though it's usually perceived as a private crime. But it is political because they are subjected to not only torture. So that's why there are more female shoes. But I think it's important to see that these people who are not have not been buried, they occupy a space in a society. I mean, they are a social figure, and there is a lot of tension around them, and so the work, this work attempts to it's like it's like joining the voices of the families and claiming for truth.
That leads us to another piece, Untitled, that is a body of work you worked on for 20 plus years. We have an installation here at the Guggenheim Museum, and we zoom a little closer. Do you want to talk a bit about these filled voids, filled pieces that of course cannot contain anything anymore or cannot function anymore because you filled them?
Yeah, well, I was interviewing, there was a political party that was completely exterminated in Colombia. 5,377 people were murdered from this political party. So it was called the UP. And I was interviewing mostly widows, both male and female, of the experience of all of a sudden, if you're sitting with a person for 20 years and then the person has breakfast there and you're here, all of a sudden the empty chair, because the person has been killed, is screaming the absence of that loved person. So I try to destroy this furniture, making them dysfunctional. Nobody can use them. Nobody has the right to use them because the person who used to use them is no longer there. So for me, also was a way of showing that some people, for example, from the right in Colombia, were thinking that these deaths were kind of just death because you have to get rid of the left. And so I think art needs to break these frozen thoughts, these frozen ideas that people have about their enemies, and that's why I was putting this clothing in there, showing that the humanity. There are so many elements that tell us about a life that is completely lost, because just as death is silence, so concrete has the last word, like violence. So I wanted to inscribe in these pieces those acts of violence without ever presenting the violent act itself. So it is presenting violence without violence. You know something happened, but you don't know why. You don't know exactly, and you don't see the actual violent event. So it is very, very important for me to present this act of violence like it's like something happened and you don't know exactly the time, whether it's recent or it happened a long time ago. You don't really know what sort of force did it, certainly it is inhuman. So that's the way I work with the concrete.
Your work often is nothing short of seeming like a miracle. How have you done that? You're doing the impossible. You're stitching together objects with hair, and you're cracking the turbine hall floor open. It's like, but the ultimate miracle would be to give that family their father or brother back. So the ultimate miracle you cannot perform. You can give dignity, you can give beauty. Do you feel powerless in these moments?
Absolutely. Our art, aesthetic redemption is impossible, unfortunately. I cannot give anybody the life back, or I cannot mend anything. So I am working from the perspective of the powerless, absolutely. Art is powerless. I think if art were powerful, it will cease to be art at that very moment. And yet, it has the capacity to give us dignity, and that's a lot. That's a lot. It has the capacity to help all of us to understand aspects of humanity that were previously unknown. Art has the capacity to change the present, because it gives us an image of the present that we were missing, that we weren't understanding. So it is powerless in the sense that I cannot feed the hunger of millions of people. I cannot save life. Obviously that cannot be done, but it can give the dignity, it can give the emotion, it can give us the understanding that we are missing. I think my task as an artist is to respond to a crisis, and maybe that response that I'm giving to that crisis, maybe somebody else can adhere to it, maybe somebody else find it valuable or important or meaningful. And so it's like art lends its idea to whoever wants to carry them. So that life that was destroyed, and the dreams of this little dress of this little girl, the dreams that were destroyed, they can go on. It's like the life did not end it. The person that was violently killed, that life was not ended. That life can continue into our present, and it is here with us because we are looking at it. So it's a bit. Franz Rosenzweig used to talk about the concept of eternal life, not as it is conceived in religious terms, but if somebody's killed, at the same time somebody is cooking a meal, and somebody is being born, and somebody is walking or biking, and so life is an eternal life. And I think art can convey very clearly that idea of an eternal life.
I keep on asking you always the same questions when we meet, because of course I'm fascinated by the same artist and by the same work. And I've asked you that question about the powerlessness before once. And I think it was because I'm German and originally from Berlin. You said, "Oh, Klaus, it's like the angel of history from Walter Benjamin. You're thrown through history, but you're thrown with your back facing it, so you're going backwards. You can't see on the back of your head, so you only see back." Which
well, go ahead.
No, please.
No, go ahead. No, I was just going to say that the angel of history there is this wing that caught his wings, and he has to leave. I have to do the opposite. I have to stay and look.
I think I'm really grateful for your work, because otherwise that's, for me, and it sounds a little bit cheesy, but for me, a moment of presence with a work of art, and don't quote me on that, but there is the moment of epiphany with truth and beauty.
Yeah.
when people say something as cheesy as I just say to you, what do you answer? Is that something for you? How do you see the moment of presence with your work?
Oh, I don't think that's cheesy. I think that's beautiful. I think that it is important. We have been taught in the world of contemporary art that feelings are kind of cheesy, that feelings are not accepted, that feelings are not of good taste, that you have to be sober and distant and cold. And I believe them the very opposite. I think it is the emotion of the feeling that bring us close to these lost lives. And I think a good work of art should open up avenues for the society to understand truth. It's not that the art delivers truth, but it opens up ways for the society to reach its own conclusions and to find its own truth. So I totally agree with what you just said.
Oh, I can continue to be cheesy. This is a work that I consider one of the most magical pieces of yours. And if we go a little closer, you finally understand what you're doing, but you only see what you did here. And what you did do here with your studio, with the geniuses you have working in your team, is basically you're putting two pieces of furniture together, two tables, you make them, repair them, put them together as one, but you do it by having thousands of tiny holes in the wood and stitching it together with human hair. So what you basically see here is a weaving together of two heavy objects with something incredibly fragile, human. How do you even think of a process like this, and what was your inspiration behind this work?
Well, at the time,
it's called Orphan's Tunic.
Orphan's Tunic. I was interviewing children who had witnessed the murder of their parents. And I was interviewing a little girl in the northern Colombia, in Urabá. And every time I went to visit her, she was wearing the same dress. And the dress was clearly too small for her. She couldn't close it in the back. And one day, as I was going back to Bogota, I drove by the orphanage where she was staying. It was like 5 a.m. in the morning, and I brought a doll for her. And I thought she would be asleep, and she was washing the dress. And then she told me that it was the dress her mother made for her. So she was always wearing that. So that's where the orphan's tunic came from. And it was such an amazing waste of lives. We had at the time this American company, Chiquita Banana, organizing the murder of unionized banana workers in the north of Colombia. And so there were so many massacres at the time that I wanted a gesture that was as difficult, as impossible, as a waste of time, as a waste of energy, as this amazing waste of lives. And I could think of nothing worse than embroidering in wood, which is a completely absurd gesture. And these people were so poor, so miserably poor, that they had nothing. So I always trying to connect with the victims, their surroundings, the kind of materials they have. And these people have nothing, absolutely nothing. I decided that all they had was their own hair, maybe, and broken furniture. So that's why I started making these pieces.
I go a little deeper. You basically said nearly en passant, you said like Chiquita Banana, it's a brand, I ate Chiquita Bananas, so it's a brand I know, Chiquita Bananas. They hired killers to kill the union workers in front of their children. Is that what you said?
Yes, that's what I said. They supported the right-wing paramilitary groups with the intention of getting rid of the unionized workers. Yes, that's what I said. Actually, they had been, there was a trial in the States, and I mean, it's a long case. It can be followed on the web.
There's a movie that I was really, really impressed by as a kid. It's an American movie, and there is a child in the window, and the guy, father, goes out, and the policeman just beats him up. And I always imagined as a kid that must be the most fragile, embarrassing moment for a child to witness your father or your mother being beaten by the authority. What happens with these children? Like seeing your own parents being killed right in front of you. Were you ever tempted to visit that? Or this is a work from '97. That's 25 years ago.
I lost track of her. One day because the Colombian system keeps them only until they are 18 years old. When they are 18, they are kicked out of all the orphanages, and they are on their own. So I don't know whatever happened to this girl. I followed her for several years, but then I lost track of her. And usually we will see in other pieces later on, this is the root of civil war. So I hear that my father was killed by so-and-so, so when I grow up I'm gonna kill so-and-so. And that's like gang violence or civil war, or that kind of, that's what it engenders that. It engenders civil war.
When we go to the next work, that's one of the works that I think you were so incredibly brave of even trying it. And we watch a little video here that shows the process. So you were basically on the roof for a couple of days preparing the install that we are now seeing unfolding.
There you go. Well, actually, I was I spent like 3 months. I was allowed secretly to make this piece because I had not received permission from the Ministry of Justice nor from the High Court. This is a piece that refers to a terror event that happened in Colombia where the guerrilla took over the Palace of Justice, and then the army brutally retaliated, and as a result 160 people were killed, including the justices. And so it is, for many years I made attempts to make pieces, and I was not allowed to do it. I was censored. And so finally I managed to make this piece. So we start dropping the first chair at 11:35 a.m. when the guerrilla went in the building. And then I had all the autopsies of the people who have died. So approximately at the time of the death of each person, another chair was dropping. So I wanted to make this kind. For me, this was a moment where it changed, not only making a sculpture, but making kind of performative monuments. And it was a time where the memory of this event was almost erased. And so I think it's important to always think of the anniversary, because the anniversary marks the return of that, which will never return, actually. But so for many years, I made attempts, failed attempts to mark this anniversary until I finally managed to do it. So it is, and what was amazing was that at the time, nobody spoke about this event. Nobody. I only have a friend that spoke about it, and an Irish woman who wrote a book. So the three I have them to talk, but no Colombians were talking about it. And then after it happened, I don't know, somehow it came back to us. People were talking about it in the press, and actually it's being fought in courts since then. So it continues to be alive, that memory.
You were also an eyewitness. 1985, you were working in an office just a couple of blocks nearby, right?
I was unfortunately I witnessed this. I was working 2 blocks away in a museum, Banco de la República, and when I heard the first shot, I ran, and when I got to to the square, to the main square, I saw the tanks rolling in. And I stayed as much as I could. And I returned, but of course, it was impossible to come close. But then you had the sound, you have the smell, you have everything, terror there.
When an institution like the Bayerle invites you, or the Tate invites you, or a biennial invites you, of course, this is a very site-specific. You were there 2 blocks away when it happened in 1985. You do this as a memorial commemorating it, but I think what you do is also so incredibly relevant, because if we go to the next piece, of course, you look for the disappearing or the disappeared or the not repaired or the voids. You look for the voids or you create the voids. And this was, you were invited to the Istanbul Biennial. And you and I talked about it, so it's important because you know, I know, and I know you know. So we should still share this with everybody. Talk a little bit what your observation was coming to Istanbul and seeing all these beautiful mansions and beautiful houses that were left over, lost, or run down or fallen apart.
For me, this piece is like a topography of war. I was walking around Istanbul and there were so many ruins that it didn't make sense to have so many ruins in a rich area in the center of the city. It was not logical. And then by researching, I understood that these buildings had belonged to either Armenian or Jewish family who had been forced out because at some point they were imposed a tax that was, I think it was 230% of what you own. And if you didn't pay that, you had to go to forced labor. And so many people left and many people were killed, as we all know, in 1915. And so this is the product of a genocide, of forceful displacement, and of course of the brutality of nationalistic ideologies. So I wanted to bring all this life and all the chaos of war into this space. So creating a building where that was full, absolutely full of empty chairs that mark the absence of all these lives that were lost, brutally lost at the time. So we, I made this piece perfectly flat. It is perfectly flat. I wanted to juxtapose the chaos of war. Of course, war is chaotic, everything falls apart, people get killed, it's filthy, it's whatever. But at the same time, war is always organized, cruelly organized, rationally organized. Somebody sits in a desk and designs arms. It's not by chance. And they tested it, and they know what's better. And they understand the way the bullet will go through the body and will damage which organs, and how far it will go in the damage, or bombs. I mean, there is industrialized war is thought out, is designed, and that cruelty, that rationality, is that's what I wanted to mark by having this absolute flat surface. So so you see, it's completely flat. So it is the juxtaposition of that flatness, that flatness with the chaos, and also it is in between two buildings, and that's the way we perceive war. Like right now, we are here in this peaceful space, and yet we know that there is war next door, in Europe. So war is inscribed into our normal everyday life, like nothing is happening. So that's why I wanted this to be inscribed into buildings that were functional, that had businesses and so on and so forth. And because that is the nature of war. We're so insensitive that we're used to it, and we allow it to happen.
I was fortunate enough to eavesdrop yesterday. I was seated near you in your vicinity at a lunch, and you and Peter Zumthor were talking. and Peter Zumthor was talking about the spaces he creates and the houses. And you said all the spaces, the houses I design are completely full. You cannot enter them, you cannot inhabit them, which I now think that you filled this void, and when you go and you said this perfect flatness of the work, and then you also see here the incredible, you see the electrical wires. This is not a wire to keep the chairs from falling. This actually is electricity from
the street,
house A to house C. But the systematic brutality here, it's like Kafka, bureaucracy administering the missing.
Yeah, but it's also the fact that that war is extended. War is no longer fought between armies. Well, since the 20th century, it's not war. It's not soldier to soldier. It's whoever is around. So it is civilians. So I wanted that mixture of life to include the fact that war is no longer fought between civilians, between armies. Sorry, it's mainly the target of war now is mainly civilians.
The fragile impossibility here that you established in Istanbul, when I saw the next slide, I saw this installation neither at White Cube in London. It feels very light. First of all, I didn't understand how difficult it must have been to even install it. So you see White Cube, no pun intended, and then you see that this wire mesh, the wire mesh is basically pushed into the wall, and then at certain places it sticks out and reveals itself as a brutal cutting wire mesh it is. And here we have a detail of that. And in our first conversation, you basically said that you were inspired by the history of concentration camps. And this is 2004. This is basically also, say something about it. Say something, what inspired you to do that in 2004?
One of the subjects that I have researched the most is concentration camps. They have a long history, and I was shocked. The first concentration camp was created in Cuba by the Spaniards. The General Martinez Campos in 1894 created the first concentration camp, and I was shocked when Guantanamo, then the Americans created the concentration camp against in Cuba. So it's like the full circle. I used to wonder before, of course no longer now, but like in the 90s, I used to wonder how people in the 30s, did they know about the concentration camps? Were they aware of what was happening? And if so, how can you live with it? And then the answer was, yeah, probably they knew, as we know now, that there are concentration camps all over the world. We know, we are aware of that. And we live with it. So I wanted to put the white wall that protects us, that, you know, we go home and we have a roof and we have walls that protect us from the wind and from the rain and from the outside world. And I wanted to inscribe into that comfort zone that we inhabit the mesh of the cages. I use this wire mesh because it cuts through the wall, not knowing that was the mesh the American actually used to make the cages that were outdoors in Guantanamo. So it was, I don't know if it's a coincidence that when one is working in one subject, one gets so intuitive and synchronized with whatever is happening that's it's not coincidence. So that's the way we now experience concentration camps. We know they are around, all around us, and then we ignore them. So the same thing happened in the 30s.
When I was in Los Angeles, I learned in one of the community meetings in Little Tokyo, where the Geffen is, that the local community talked about the site as a site as of a former concentration camp. And I was completely disturbed by that. What happened? And so the local Japanese community was concentrated in that area after Pearl Harbor, because there was a general suspicion. If you're Japanese, you're collaborating with the enemy. So they were all put together in that area where now the museum is. And they explained to me that their definition of a concentration camp is, and it's a very, very sad definition, is more people are putting in that will ever leave, because the concentration camps normally has no food, no water, no infrastructure, all of this. And your history between the Cuban to the Guantanamo Bay, how did you feel putting this into a gallery in London? Was that, for you, was that a special place, or was it just that you felt, because also site-specific is that this gallery is called White Cube, right? Yeah. So it's all of a sudden, it becomes something more than just a vain, minimalist statement.
Yeah. No, as I was saying, for me it was juxtaposing these two worlds that we simultaneously inhabit. The piece was specifically made for White Cube because I think it was a subject that was running around the entire world. Everybody was talking about it. It was after 9/11. People were in solidarity with the Americans, and nobody thought for a minute of the huge injustice that was being perpetrated on these poor inmates that even nowadays continue to be there. But there are variations of the concentration camp. You have more than 500 prisons for refugees in Europe. You have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of so-called refugee waiting zones in the States and basically in every border. You have concentration camps in China, in Russia, Myanmar. It's everywhere. It's literally everywhere. So it's not. It's an issue that should be important for all of us.
The average time, we talked about that before, the average time a person, a family stays in a refugee camp is not a week or a day. The average time all over the world a person stays in a refugee camp is 17 years. It's unbelievable if you think about the unsurmountable amount of time that this has.
Doing nothing because they are not allowed to work. They're just there.
Going to this piece here, it's a Castello di Rivoli. I just do a little bit what a curator should do, describe a picture, Bildbeschreibung. So we see one of the less ornate rooms at the Castello di Rivoli. It's a great collection and museum of contemporary art in Torino. And so Castello is inviting you, Doris, and you look at the space, and I think what you did with this is so unexpected and so grand, and so it can only be you. Of course it can only be you. Do you want to say a little bit what you did and how you did it? Because actually you think it might be effortless, but you were hand-painting bricks. So what did you do here?
Well, when I saw this room that, as you said, had no ornaments because of the war, because Napoleon invaded and they couldn't finish it. So usually spaces like this where power is exerted are decorated and they are made more livable. But this one was raw. It's raw power. And so what I wanted to do was to make almost tangible the excess power that is exerted on migrants that have become slaves. There are approximately 40 million enslaved people in the world, many in Europe. So there is human trafficking all over the world. So these people have no option. escape. This is it. They are forced into whatever prostitution or construction labor or meat packing or whatever, but they are forced into that, and we all allow that to happen because we don't care about the fate of the migrant. So I wanted to make an impossible piece. Really, we usually build walls from down up, and in this case, the wall is built from the very opposite, which is of course absurd. And I stopped right before the room was completely entombed. So still there is a little bit of light. I think that for a lot of people, the possibility of having a life, a dignified life, is zero, is none. Especially for this enslaved. I remember reading about a woman that had been enslaved in prostitution in Torino, and she was so desperately, she tried to escape and jump from a window, second-story building window, and of course she's in a wheelchair. So I had the chance to meet her, and that kind of situation, it's life is not possible. So I wanted to mark that. The space, of course, has to do with power, and architecture not only protects bodies, but it dominates the bodies that are behind it. So I wanted to make that architecture of power even more evident in this piece.
Since we have 150 slides, we're going towards the 3 hours. I might skip the next one, so
okay.
You don't want to look so what we're skipping, because I know it's impossible. And I skip towards a work so many of us saw. Again, an impossibility, and shibboleth is, and correct me if I'm wrong, because he explained it to me once, and I'm trying to reconstruct it. So there was, in the Bible, there was a phonetic test. Are you a migrant, or do you have the right to be here? And people had to pronounce shibboleth. And they couldn't. And if they couldn't, they would be killed.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like a language test for, yes, you're a migrant, or you can live.
Yeah, exactly that. The Bible describes the huge massacre. 40,000 people were killed in a war between two tribes, and but that, so it is the dying. I wanted to signal the dying at crossing borders. Actually. Shibboleth has always marked who can live and who will die at that attempt of crossing borders. It has been used several times in many, not only in the Bible, but in the war between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Haitians were forced to say the word perejil, which they couldn't pronounce properly, so they were killed. Or in the independence war in Colombia, we were forced to say Zaragoza, and of course the Spaniards would pronounce it differently, so people will be killed. So shibboleth has always marked that, and I'm sure there are many more examples that I don't know of. So I wanted to mark the difference between humanity and infrahumanity. And of course, if you have the certain texture of hair, certain color of the skin, you are out. You have to live. You are an underclass. Actually, the fact that the word underclass exists is terrible. So I wanted to mark the space, the global south, we from the global south inhabit, and that's a negative space. And wherever we are, the earth will open up, and in the crack inside you had a mesh. So even inside, you can see a little bit here, the mesh. So even when the earth opens up, you have that. But I wanted to do this. I mean, evidently, issues of racism, migration are obvious, but I wanted to do this in a museum for several reasons. One was the name of the museum is Tate, and Mr. Tate made his money out of slaving people in the Caribbean, and so the sugarcane trade was very important. So at the very root of the museum, you had slavery. But also I wanted to point out that in the history of art, that is called the universal history of art, the darker peoples of the world, we are not present. So art history has managed to create a brilliant, beautiful image of white people. So the saints are white, the angels are white, the Virgin is white, everybody's blonde and blue-eyed, and you can recognize yourself in the history of art and in the development of modernity, as though the darker people of the non-Europeans, we have nothing to do with modernity. It is like Europe developed itself by itself without slavery, which is not the case. So I wanted to show that those who are not represented in art are those who can be killed, who are ignored, who do not exist, who are not represented. So for me, as being the first artist from Latin America, from the global south, who was invited to Turbine Hall, was very important to make that statement. I was bringing who I was. This is who I am. This is my tradition. So in this case, my biography joins with the history of the global south.
Here is a scar in the Turbine Hall as a trace.
And this is intended. It was part of the project. It was to leave this scar, because I think imperialism has scarred the entire world. So this scar should be there as a reminder of that.
It's absurd. You and I talked when we prepared to talk. It's kind of like right now, with the ecological crisis, which will become a migrant crisis, it is predicted that 2 billion, not 2 million, 2 billion people will be climate refugees. And the climate refugees will most probably come from the global south or climate-ravaged areas, trying to get entry in the global north. And if you think about it in a larger span, first, colonialism exploited the global south in a way that enabled them to produce so much carbon that the climate crisis is actually triggered. And then, of course, already on the expense of the global south, the whole world is damaged. So it's actually only kind of, it's like the yin and yang. It's kind of unavoidable. And you pointed that out yesterday in a small statement, that it literally is just like you do something and it's like it's cause and consequence. Is that something that you feel is coming from Colombia? Do you feel that this is now felt by more people? Is that slowly sinking in? Something terrible is about to happen?
Yeah, I think we are all aware of that, and especially in the areas that were destroyed by, as you say, colonialism, and now the countries who never managed to industrialize, are therefore adding very little to the climate crisis. We are the ones who are now receiving most of the toxic unrecyclable waste that the global north is producing, worsening even more our problem. So the global south is more vulnerable, of course, to climate crisis because of its location. So northern countries are safe. So it is so brutally unfair what is happening. And then when these poor people who are walking towards a better life, towards a bit of dignity, avoiding food insecurity, water scarcity, violence created by the climate crisis, then they are forced to die in this, not at home, not arrived, because they were never allowed to arrive, but in this vast liminal area of this common grave that is either the desert in the United States or the Sahara Desert or the sea, where they are dying thousands every year. The brutality of this fact can only be accepted if people who can do something, people in richer countries, remain ignorant. So I think in the global north, ignorance about historical fact, about colonialism, about dirty banking systems, about laundering drug money, all that, or whatever it takes, industry, extreme capitalism, all these facts are ignored. And this ignorance is carefully manicured, cultivated, care. Ignorance, at some point, it was thought that knowledge was power. And I think it has changed. Now, ignorance is power. So you can play the role of the ignorant. Why are these migrants here? Like, why are they making my street filthy? Why? So you can act as though you know nothing because you refuse to think. Everything is on the news, everything is out there. It's not so difficult to figure it out, but it's so convenient to forget it.
Ignorance is power, ignorance is crime.
Yeah.
When we go through the next piece, that's actually the piece you were making, producing, when I came to your studio.
Yeah.
And may I describe what I saw when I came?
Please.
I saw a table that is barely the length of a human being. So there is a table and there is a piece of earth on the table that fits exactly onto the table, and you put a table on top of it and grass is growing through it. So for me that was a coffin. For me, that was a burial. For me, that was earth to earth and resurrection. But it was definitely, I walked into the studio and it was like I saw a dead body. There are many of these that exist now, and I go further in one slide. Because I said before, you're nothing short of a miracle in your work. You're producing something. These are silent prayers, plegaria muda, silent prayers, and what you achieve here is grass growing through the tiny gaps in the wood. I was just like, I couldn't really react in a way. And then I overreacted in another way that we don't share here. But do you want to say a bit what brought you to that piece and finding that form and getting to this, what I consider a real masterpiece of yours?
I think this piece, for me, well, I began making it as I'm traveling. I noticed that there is violence. I was not traveling in LA and seeing that kids were killing each other in astonishing numbers on the streets of mainly LA and Chicago, well, every city. But and those were poor kids killing poor kids. Then in Colombia there was a terrible event where the Colombian army murdered 6,402, yes, that's the number, poor people. And they were being killed by the Colombian army. They were presented as guerrillas. discharged in combat, so the army will get prizes, condecorations, vacations, money, everything. But the soldiers were poor, and the people they were killing are also poor. So I was thinking I wanted a piece that if you turn it around, it's exactly the same. It is the fate of poor people. Because if you're poor, you inhabit a gray zone that has been described as social death. So if you are unemployed, you don't go to school, you don't have a house, you inhabit the streets, you're really one teeny tiny step, and then you will find your physical death. So social death is just, it opens the way to physical death. And that's what I was trying to show here. Also, I was thinking of civil war in a larger scale. Of course, I was thinking of the civil war in Colombia, but there are, if you go, you don't have to go that far. You can go to Spain, and in Spain you have no clue how many unmarked mass graves that have never been unearthed. And there is a discussion going on. Do you want to open this mass grave or not? So there are mass graves all over the world, including Europe. And so I wanted to make this mass grave higher. So you walk in this piece as it is like a labyrinth. But usually in cemeteries, the dead are there, down there. But here, it's a deep height. You're really into it. So I wanted to to signal, to address the mass grave, unmarked mass graves. And I wanted to isolate each body. So each body, it is as though a precarious funeral took place, a really precarious one, but it took place. Because I believe these funeral rites are absolutely essential for the human life. There's no way we can go on living if we cannot say a final adieu to a loved one. So if we do that to a loved one, it has to be done, of course, to somebody that we don't know, to some poor person that we will know. A survivor of Auschwitz, Jean Améry, used to say that the ethics with which a life was treated also marks the aesthetics of death. And I think it's very important that to create a poetics of death in my work. So all these lives are recognized as life, as such. It's not just when you see, changing the subject a little bit, when you see one of these migrant inflatable boats with 300 people, people recognize that they're breathing, that they might need food or water, but never think, have they left a family behind? Is there a baby needing them? Do they have a mother that loves them? That kind of connection is not done. So I wanted, for this reason, I wanted each single tomb to be there, isolated. They deserve space. It's not that they die in a mass murder. They need breathing space, each body. So each single person has to be marked, has to be acknowledged. And so that's why each piece has the size of a coffin, exactly the same size of a coffin.
It's one of the pieces where, and whenever, wherever that is shown, I hope I will have a chance to experience it, because that is one of the pieces where so many of your aspects come together in one presence, and you don't need to know anything of what you said right now, you just feel it, it's just there. It's in the presence of when you walk through there.
Yeah, life, one thing of this piece that I think is important is that no matter what happens, and no matter what violent event took place, life prevails. And that, so you see life coming through these graves.
There's the grass, I always, as a museum professional, you think, oh God, how do I keep it alive throughout the 3 months of the exhibition?
It's very easy. It does.
But you have this magical touch of, in Timothy Morton, OOO, between living object and dead objects. What's the difference between a little chicken and a stone and a plant? And what is the objecthood of something? Sometimes you keep this in an equilibrium where the association of life and death is balanced here, because you feel death, but you see life. In another piece you did, you treated rose petals with collagen, so they don't really rot, but they're not really alive anymore. There's still these fragile rose petals that are somewhere kept between life and death. They're not dry, but they're still very, very fragile. And I want to show a little video. So these are these rose petals that you were basically What was the motivation for this piece, Doris?
I wanted to, at the time, there was a discussion, mainly in the States, about what was during the Bush years. They were discussing openly in the newspaper what is torture. I mean, we all know what is torture. You don't have to discuss it. There are no limits. Of course, we all know. And nonetheless, there was this endless discussion during the Bush years about torture, and I thought it was absolutely insane. I was interviewing, no, sorry, I didn't interview. I learned of the torture, terrible torture of a nurse in Colombia by the right-wing paramilitary, that squads. And I wanted to present a flower offering to this victim. And then I started thinking, how do you approach a tortured body? Even if you want to heal it, you will create pain. So I wanted to look for the most delicate, the most fragile element I could think of. And so I wanted to make this shroud and I wanted to make it huge, because there were so many bodies that were not properly delivered to death, that were tortured to death. That's not the way it should be. So I started making this huge shroud, and I wanted these roses to remain, as you said before, in a stage that were not dead nor alive, but that is still, you see how you see that we were stitching this shroud together. Was extremely delicate task, and maybe honor these victims, and think that it is absurd that this type of brutality is happening nowadays. I mean, no matter how developed the world is, no matter how much technical gadgets we developed, still there is a basic human brutality very much alive. And so I wanted to point that out.
This piece, Disremembered, we have an installation shot here. I have installed this once, the work, and what is very fragile, things that are fragile are also things that are potentially hurting. And this is one. Do you want to say a little bit about what that actually is as an object?
These blouses were made after I interview mothers who have lost their only children to violence. Their only child to violence. And I understood that there is another layer of violence. After they endure this terrible loss, after they endure the loss of their son or daughters, they had to endure the indifference of society. If they became unpleasant presence. They became, if somebody was going to have a party, if you're going to throw a party, you don't want to invite this person because this person carries with herself this pain and this sadness that is unsurmountable. There's no way you can go back to a normal everyday life after an event like that. And I was thinking also of the Inquisition, when the victims of the Inquisition were forced to wear this garment of shame, this San Benito, that hurt their skin. And I think I saw these pieces as the shroud we place on these victims that we don't want to accompany. We want to leave them apart because this capitalist society is always compulsory, telling us that we have to be happy. So sadness is not allowed, pain is not allowed. So these women are entirely blocked out of any happy event. And at the end, you realize that they create organizations where they meet among themselves because they are really discriminated against. So I think victims are discriminated against because they bring sadness in a society that doesn't want to open up a space for it.
This is a piece where there's certain layers. I see you making a drawing, doing research, interviews. That's all you keep for yourself. You don't even show or share. Then you have your studio that is making things possible. How do we stitch rose petals together? How do we get the collagen into the petals? And then you have that other layer where you have a more social practice. And I use this, we had a couple of examples, but in the interest of the 3 hours, I think we perhaps should only look at this one. This is one of these social practices you do. And that was in midst of a political moment where everybody was hoping for a peace treaty. And the peace treaty was, you were waiting. Do you want to describe a little bit what this actually...
There was a referendum in Colombia to see if the peace agreement that the government had signed with the FARC guerrilla could be approved. And like any referendum, what it accomplishes is that it breaks a country in two. So the against peace, the team against peace won, and by 50,000 votes. So I was in mourning. I wanted to mourn this moment, the moment when we lost the possibility of peace. So I wrote the name of 0.7% of the victims that had died in the war, and I wrote it with ashes to mark that this is being forgotten already. And we stitched this to make a huge shroud in the main square of Bogota, and 10,000 people participated in the making of this piece. So it became a really collective, performative monument.
It's a beautiful work. Here we have an installation shot of Tabula Rasa, 2018. And if you look at the details, so we actually selected, Doris and I selected some details, so we can share with you what's actually happened in the piece, because as I said before, it's nothing short of a miracle that you technically, physically, architecturally find a solution. What are we looking at? What are we looking at, Doris? I was
interviewing victims of rape, and if you interview victims of torture, they have marks, physical marks, scars. But these victims of rape, their scars are not visible, and yet they are completely scarred. And they managed to put themselves together. Whatever the victim was before the attack, that person no longer is after the attack. If the person used to sing, for example, they will be unable to think again afterwards, or any activity will be completely erased from their memories. Like whatever they were is gone, and they have to rebuild themselves from scratches. And so this piece was a way I splinter teeny tiny bits of wood, the tables, and then we put it back together. And this is how I see them. So these are almost trembling objects, fragile objects that no longer are good for performing the task that you usually assign to tables, like writing or eating on them. But nonetheless, they are standing up, and they have the form of the table. So it is this tension of destroying and mending, which I think is how these women live, women and men live their lives after sexual attack.
Mm-hmm. Incredible pieces. That's very impressive. It's not a work of art yet.
No, yet. It is 37 tons of weapons that the FARC guerrilla gave up as a result of signing the peace agreement. And these 37 tons of weapons were given to me, and I decided the idea was to make a monument. Actually, it is written in the peace agreement that a monument should be built with the arms. But once I had the arms, I realized I could not make a monument. Arms do not deserve to be monumentalized. We cannot look at them as though it is an ideal that can put us all together. So I decided to melt them down, all the 37 tons. And then I invited, again, victims of rape, women who had been raped by armed men. And with them, we hammered the metal, and hammered the metal for days. And with this metal, once the metal of the guns were turned to tiles that make this space. There is a museum in Bogota that is called Fragmentos. And so it is, I symbolically reverse the function of a weapon. Usually, armed men can really stand on the civilian population. So now we, all civilians, we can go and stand on these arms. And these arms are, since they are the floor of a museum is the site for life. Well, because the creativity of artists will be present. So every 6 months we have a new artist exhibiting his or her work in this space, and we make permanently workshops with victims, creative workshops with victims. This building was designed by the architect Carlos Granada, who also designed the technical elements of Palimpsest. And he decided to leave the ruins of this old house to mark the fact that war leaves nothing by ruins.
That's a work in progress, in process.
Yeah, this is a render of, as you were mentioning before, the relationship between migration and climate crisis. And I think this migration and climate crisis we have seen only the beginning, and it will become much, much worse. I think the migrant will never have a home. They are never welcome. Emmanuel Levinas changed the Cartesian dictum, I think, therefore I exist, for I dwell, therefore I exist. And he says that in order to exist, you must be welcome. And evidently, migrants are not welcome. So this is an uninhabitable house, nomadic house that can go from place to place, and it disaggregates little by little until it turns into a dead forest.
How do you make that? How do you think of making that?
Well, I'm thinking of the fact that the migrants do not have the possibility of inhabiting to be inside a space. For them, everything is out space. So they are out of the frontier, out of the border, out of their home. If they are out in the streets, even the police take their blankets away. They are kicked out of the streets. So they don't have the possibility of inhabiting. So this is what this house is addressing, this impossibility. So you have, at the same time, the uninhabitable house. The trees are placed together in such a way that they become a wall. And then you see the dead forest, which is also uninhabitable. Many areas of the world are already not good for agriculture any longer. So there is literally no place for them.
Will you use dead trees, or will you carve them, or?
We have found dead trees in an area in Colombia, and I asked farmers for permission to take the trees out, and we exchange each tree for 3 live ones. So the piece will have at the end 804 trees, dead trees.
How long is this piece gonna last? Do you conserve those trees? Do you varnish them?
Yes. Well, I started making this piece in 2020, so almost 3 years of working. And I always work with conservators. Always work with a workshop of conservators, and they advise me on what to use. So before I start thinking of the material, actually testing the material, I have a team of conservators. The contemporary studio from New York, Christian Scheidemann. So he advised some resins that we apply in the process. So
what happened to the rose petals?
Oh, it's perfectly fine.
What happens to the grass? Does the grass sleep when it's in
grass,
storage?
We change the grass because a vegetable material, organic material, cannot cross borders. So we plant the trees in each the grass in each museum.
It's such a wonderful Sunday lunch talk to talk about torture and death and mourning. I think it's so important that we allow these feelings. When you described the shroud, the disremembered, you described the shroud also in terms of the Inquisition shroud. I think your work brings aspects of life into the White Cube, or the Holy Grail of Bayerle Foundation, that we perhaps only see in art or on crazy uncensored media, where somebody all of a sudden puts images in that then immediately get filtered out because we're all not allowed to see it or feel it or smell it or hear it. Or I wanted to end the talk on a more cheerful note, more positive note. And you and I looked at this image here as the ending image, because I do think we don't want to say, oh, we were just kidding, the world is fine. We're not kidding, the world is not fine. But this feels hopeful, and I still believe in art, and I still believe that it's kind of interesting. The only things that are left from ancient Egypt or ancient Rome is kind of basically art, or we afterwards declared it art.
Yeah.
And what you're doing here is a little bit perhaps a takeover. I think the future of the world doesn't necessarily have to be the future of the human world. Perhaps it's the future of the world without us, because we were just an error for a time. Do you want to talk about this? Because I think this is such an incredibly hopeful piece.
Yes and no, because again.
Oh, you're kidding.
Again, well, this is the title of this piece. Is a project. This is a render. It's an unrealized project. It is the forest of absences. So I want to create a forest with 2,500 arboreal chairs. Each chair is made out of 4 trees that is bended in order to create these fragile chairs that should remain empty, because the migrants for whom these chairs are intended are dead. So I think maybe belatedly we should open a space for them. They all attempted to come to Europe, but they never managed to do it. So I want to create a site for them in absence and grant them the possibility to be in a place, to have a chair for themselves. So these chairs will be alive, and hopefully they will grow as a forest that would allow us to think of them. These pieces need to be, like any garden, it needs to be trimmed, it needs to be taken care of, it needs to have fertilizers, it needs to have water, it needs to have care. And life needs care. So that's what this work is all about. It's about caring for the memories of those who were not granted respect or space for life. So it is hopeful, but again, it's addressing the loss of lives of migrants.
There's a lot of truth, and there's a lot of beauty in your work, and I can only personally thank you, because you know I might get emotional, and I'm not going to do that today. So I can just thank you for all this dignity that you bring.
Thank you.
And you can't help it. Love you.
Thank you so much. Oh, you were sweet to me. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. You're sweet.
Perfect.
Thank you.